The Arab Spring was a series of social movements that began in late 2010 and spread throughout 2011, affecting numerous Arab countries. These movements had a significant impact on politics and society in the region. To understand the Arab Spring, it is essential to know the context in which these movements emerged. Most Arab countries were governed by authoritarian regimes, where power was concentrated in a single person or a small elite. These leaders had been in power for decades. Furthermore, corruption and nepotism were rampant. State resources were distributed among a small circle of people close to power, while the majority of the population suffered from poverty and unemployment. Many young people, even those with a university education, could not find work, generating deep discontent. Political freedoms were very limited in these countries. People could not freely express their opinions or participate in the political process in a meaningful way. With the rise of social media, information and ideas spread more quickly. People could organize and share their experiences of injustice more effectively. This context of widespread discontent and the ability to organize through social media laid the foundation for the uprisings we know as the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring began in Tunisia in December 2010, when Mohamed Bouazizi, a young street vendor, blew himself up in protest against corruption and police harassment. This act of desperation triggered a wave of mass protests that led to the fall of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in January 2011. This was a crucial moment, as it showed that it was possible to overthrow a dictator through popular protests. Inspired by the events in Tunisia, Egyptians began demonstrating on January 25, 2011. The protests gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square and attracted millions of people. After 18 days of protests, President Hosni Mubarak resigned on February 11, 2011, after 30 years in power. In Libya, protests against Muammar Gaddafi's regime began in February 2011. The country quickly descended into armed conflict. NATO intervention and internal opposition resulted in the fall of Gaddafi in October 2011, but Libya was plunged into chaos and conflict that persists to this day. In Yemen, protests began in January 2011. The country was already facing serious problems of poverty and internal conflict. The protests eventually led to the resignation of President Ali Abdullah Saleh in February 2012, after 33 years in power. However, Yemen also fell into a protracted conflict. Protests in Syria began in March 2011 against President Bashar al-Assad. The violent repression of the demonstrations led to a civil war that has left hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced. Other countries were also affected by the Arab Spring. In Bahrain, protests began in February 2011. The government, with the help of Saudi Arabia, harshly repressed the protesters. In Jordan and Morocco, there were protests. But government responses included some reforms that eased tensions without overthrowing leaders. The Arab Spring had mixed consequences. In some countries, it led to the fall of authoritarian leaders and the implementation of political reforms. However, in many cases, these reforms were superficial or later reversed. In countries such as Syria and Libya, protests led to protracted and violent conflicts that continue to affect millions of people. In some places, such as Egypt, initial changes were followed by renewed repression. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who came to power after a military coup in 2013, has been accused of establishing a regime even more authoritarian than Mubarak's. The Arab Spring also had a significant impact on global politics and the perception of protest movements. It showed the power of social networks and popular mobilization. However, underlying problems, such as poverty, unemployment and corruption, persist in many of these countries. Political instability has exacerbated these problems in some cases. The Arab Spring was a complex phenomenon with mixed results. While it demonstrated the power of the people to challenge oppressive regimes, it also underscored the challenges of building stable democracies in contexts with deep divisions and structural problems. The region continues to grapple with the consequences of these movements, and the path to stability and prosperity remains uncertain.